was hired to babysit an 18-year-old. Now I know why the other babysitters quit. I never should have taken that babysitting job. The moment I stepped into that suburban nightmare, I knew something was off. But I needed the money, and honestly, how bad could watching an 18-year-old be? Turns out pretty fucking bad. It all started when I saw the ad online. Babysitter needed for 18-year-old son. Great pay, flexible hours. I know what you're thinking. Why the hell does an 18-year-old need a babysitter? That's exactly what I asked Mrs. Vandell when I showed up for the interview. Oh, Robert's special, she said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. He needs supervision. Someone to make sure he takes his medication, doesn't leave the house, that sort of thing. I nodded, trying not to let my confusion show. The pay was incredible, way more than I'd ever made babysitting before. And as a broke college student, I couldn't afford to be picky. There's just one more thing, Mr. Vandell added, his deep voice startling me. I hadn't even noticed him enter the room. The last few babysitters, well, they didn't work out. Left rather abruptly, I'm afraid. But I'm sure that won't be a problem with you, will it, Adriana? Something in his tone made me want to run, but I pushed the feeling aside. Of course not, sir. I'm very reliable. And that's how I found myself alone in the Vandell house on a Friday night, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. The house itself was normal enough, a typical suburban two-story with a manicured lawn and a white picket fence. But something about it felt off. Maybe it was the way the floorboards creaked even when no one was walking on them, or how the air felt thick and heavy, like the house was holding its breath. Robert was in his room when I arrived. Mrs. Vandell introduced us briefly before she and her husband left for their date night. "Remember Adriana," she said, her hand gripping my arm just a little too tightly. "Robert doesn't leave his room after 8 p.m. And whatever you do, don't go into the basement." I laughed nervously. "Why? You got a monster down there or something?" Neither of them smiled. Mr. Vandell just said, "The basement door stays locked for everyone's safety." And with that cheerful goodbye, they were gone, leaving me alone with Robert in a house full of secrets. For the first few hours, everything was fine. Robert stayed in his room, only emerging once to grab a snack. He barely spoke 2 words to me, just nodded and disappeared back upstairs. It wasn't until around 10 p.m. that things started to get weird. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A soft thump, like something heavy hitting the floor. Then another, and another, and another. It was coming from the basement. My heart started racing. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a raccoon had gotten in somehow, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I tried to ignore it, I really did, but the thumps kept coming, growing louder and more insistent. And then I heard something else, a voice, muffled but unmistakable, calling out for help. Fuck. I knew I shouldn't go down there. Every horror movie I'd ever seen was screaming at me to get the hell out of that house. But what if someone was hurt? What if the Vandells had been in an accident and somehow ended up trapped in their own basement? I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the basement door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the lock. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire house. I flicked on my flashlight and peered down the stairs. Nothing but darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone down there?" No response, just more thumping. Taking a deep breath, I started down the stairs. Each step creaked and groaned under my weight, and I swear I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness. When I reached the bottom, I swept my flashlight around the room. It looked like a normal basement at first. Washing machine, dryer, some old boxes piled in corners. But then my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. A door that shouldn't be there, hidden behind a stack of boxes. As I approached it, the thumping grew louder. It was definitely coming from behind that door. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn back, to run out of the house and never look back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed help. I tried to turn the knob, but it was locked. Panic rising in my throat, I pressed my ear against the wood. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible. Help. My flashlight beam caught something, a thin crack between the door and the frame. I leaned in close, trying to peek through. An eye, a human eye, wide with fear, staring back at me through the crack. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. What the fuck was going on in this house? I was about to try breaking down the door when I heard footsteps upstairs. Robert, or Mr. Vandell, or whoever the hell was really living in this house. In that moment, survival instinct kicked in. I knew I couldn't let them know I'd discovered whatever sick secret they were hiding down here. Not if I wanted to make it out alive. I raced back up the stairs as quietly as I could, locking the basement door behind me. I just settled back under the couch, trying to control my breathing, when Robert appeared at the top of the stairs. "Everything okay down here?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I forced a smile. "Yeah, all good. Just watching some TV." He nodded, his eyes boring into me like he could see right through my lie. Then he turned and went back to his room. As soon as he was gone, I let out a shaky breath. I knew I should run, should call the police, should do anything but stay in this house of horrors. But the image of that eye pleading for help was burned into my mind. And the reality of my situation hit me hard. I was broke, desperate. I needed this job, at least for a few more nights until I could figure out what to do. So I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I decided to stay, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, to come back tomorrow night and the night after that until I could find a way to help whoever was trapped in that basement. Little did I know, I was walking right into a nightmare that was far worse than anything I could have imagined. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that terrified eye staring back at me through the crack in the basement door. But I had to go back. I needed the money, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone down there needed my help. The next night, I arrived at the Vandell house with a pit in my stomach. Mrs. Vandell greeted me with that same plastic smile. "Oh, Adriana, we're so glad you came back," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "So many babysitters find Robert challenging." I forced a smile. "No problems here, Mrs. Vandell. Robert's a breeze." As soon as they left, I started planning. I needed to find a way into that basement room, but I couldn't risk getting caught. I spent the first few hours pretending everything was normal, checking on Robert periodically and watching TV with the volume up to mask any sounds I might make. Around midnight, I heard Robert's door close. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my phone and the flashlight I'd brought from home. This time, I was prepared. The basement was just as creepy as I remembered. My heart pounded as I approached the hidden door, praying it would somehow be unlocked this time. No such luck. I pressed my ear against the wood. "Hello," I whispered. "Is anyone there?" For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, so faint I almost missed it. "Please, help us." Us. There was more than one person down there. I fumbled with my phone, pulling up the lock-picking video I'd watched earlier. It looked so easy online, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the bobby pin steady. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I heard a soft click. The door creaked open, and the smell hit me like a punch to the gut. Sweat, blood, and something worse. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a nightmare. The room was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet, and it was full of people. Young women, mostly, crammed together like sardines. Some were barely conscious. Others stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Oh my God," I breathed. "What the fuck is this?" One of the girls, her face gaunt and her eyes sunken, spoke up. "You're the new babysitter, aren't you?" Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't used it in a long time. "They always bring in a new one when they take one of us." The implications of her words made me want to vomit. I don't understand. Who are you? What is this place?" "We're the other babysitters," another girl said, "the ones who left abruptly." My mind was reeling. This couldn't be happening. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life, in normal suburbs with white picket fences. "We have to get you out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll call the police. No," several of them shouted at once, then immediately hushed, glancing fearfully at the ceiling. "You can't," the first girl said. "They'll know. They always know. And then you'll end up down here with us, and the next babysitter will come, and the cycle will continue." "But what about—" A noise from upstairs cut me off. "Footsteps." "Go," one of the girls hissed, "before they catch you. Please don't leave us here. Find a way to help us." I wanted to argue, to insist on getting them out right now, but I knew she was right. If I got caught, I couldn't help anyone. I closed the door, my hands shaking so bad I could barely lock it. I had just made it back upstairs when Robert appeared in the living room doorway. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. I forced a smile. "Just getting a glass of water." Thought I heard a noise, but it was nothing. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes boring into mine like he could see right through my lie. Then he nodded. "Get some sleep, Adriana. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As I watched him climb the stairs, a chill ran down my spine. Somehow, I knew he was right. Tomorrow was going to be very long indeed. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The faces of those girls haunted me every time I closed my eyes. I spent the night researching, trying to find any information about missing persons in the area, about the Vandals, about anything that could help me make sense of this nightmare. I found nothing. It was like the Vandals didn't exist outside of this house. The next evening, I arrived at the house with a plan. It wasn't a good plan, but it was all I had. I'd smuggled in my laptop, a portable Wi-Fi hotspot, and a small camera. If I couldn't get the girls out tonight, I'd at least get proof to take to the police. Mrs. Vandal greeted me with that same plastic smile. "Adriana, dear, we're so pleased you're settling in well. Robert seems quite fond of you." The way she said it made my skin crawl. As soon as they left, I set up my laptop in the living room. The camera pointed at the basement door. Then I waited. Hours passed. Robert stayed in his room. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Around midnight, I heard it. A soft click like a lock turning. Then footsteps coming up from the basement. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. The basement door opened, and Mr. Vandal stepped out. But he wasn't alone. He was dragging one of the girls from the hidden room. I bit back a scream. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, her mouth gagged. She looked right at me, silently pleading for help. Mr. Vandal didn't notice me. He was too focused on his task, pulling the girl towards the front door. I knew I should do something. Call the police. Scream. Anything. But I was frozen in place, watching in horror as he opened the front door and shoved the girl into a waiting van. As soon as the door closed behind him, I sprang into action. I grabbed my laptop and ran to the basement. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the lock, but finally, the door swung open. "We have to go now," I whispered urgently to the remaining girls. "This is our chance." They looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear. Slowly, painfully, they began to move. We were halfway up the basement stairs when the lights flicked on. Robert stood at the top of the stairs, a gun in his hand. Behind him, Mr. and Mrs. Vandal smiled those terrible plastic smiles. "Oh, Adriana," Mrs. Vandal sighed. "We had such high hopes for you, but I suppose you'll have to join our little family after all." I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could, something hard connected with the back of my head. The world went black. When I came to, I was in the hidden room. The other girls were gone. I was alone. No, not alone. Robert sat in the corner, watching me with those eerily calm eyes. "Why?" I croaked. "Why are you doing this?" He smiled, and for the first time I saw something human in his eyes, something sad. "Because," he said softly, "I was the first Robert, the first babysitter. And now you'll be the next Mrs. Vandell." As the meaning of his words sank in, I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and Mr. and Mrs. Vandell stood there, syringes in hand. "Welcome to the family, Adriana," Mr. Vandell said. "It's time for your first lesson." But as they approached, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to become another victim. I wasn't going to let this cycle continue. In a burst of adrenaline, I lunged forward, catching them off guard. I knocked the syringes from their hands and pushed past them, my heart pounding in my ears. I heard shouts behind me as I raced up the basement stairs, taking them two at a time. I had to get out. I had to get help. As I reached the main floor, I could hear them coming after me, but I had youth and desperation on my side. I sprinted for the front door, my fingers fumbling with the lock. Just as I heard footsteps on the stairs, I wrenched the door open and burst into the cool night air. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, not daring to look back. I could hear voices behind me, but they grew fainter as I put distance between myself and that house of horrors. I didn't stop running until I reached a 24-hour diner several blocks away. With shaking hands, I called the police. But as I waited for them to arrive, a chilling thought occurred to me. Would anyone believe my story? And even if they did, would we be able to save the others before the Vandells made them disappear? I knew one thing for certain. This nightmare was far from over. It's been 3 weeks since I escaped from the Vandell house. 3 weeks of police interviews, nightmares, and constantly looking over my shoulder. I'm writing this now because I need someone, anyone, to know what happened, to know what's still happening. When the police arrived at the diner that night, I was a mess, bruised, disheveled, and babbling about hidden rooms and kidnapped babysitters. I could see the doubt in their eyes, but they took my statement and promised to investigate. They went to the house, of course. But by then, it was too late. The Vandells were gone. The basement room was empty, scrubbed clean. There was no evidence of Robert, no sign of the other girls. Nothing to corroborate my story. I insisted they check missing persons reports, look into the history of the house. They did, but it led nowhere. It was like the Vandells had never existed. The police started to question my story. Was I on drugs? Did I have a history of mental illness? Maybe. I'd imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. The terror in those girls' eyes, the sadness in Robert's. It was real, all of it. I've spent every waking moment since then trying to find proof. I've scoured social media, online forums, local news archives. I've reached out to every babysitting agency in the area, trying to find others who might have encountered the Vandells. Yesterday, I finally found something. A post on an obscure missing persons forum dated 3 years ago. It was from a woman looking for her daughter who had disappeared after taking a babysitting job. The details were vague, but one thing stood out. The family's name. Vandell. It's not much, but it's a start. Proof that I'm not crazy. That somewhere out there the Vandells are still operating. Still trapping young women in their twisted family. I don't know what to do next. The police won't listen to me anymore. I'm afraid to go to the media. What if the Vandells see it and disappear again? But I can't just do nothing. So I'm posting this here, hoping someone will believe me, hoping someone might have information that could help, and most of all, hoping to warn others. If you see a job posting for a babysitter needed for an 18-year-old, don't take it. If you meet a family named Vandell, run. And if you're a young woman considering a babysitting job, please be careful. Be so careful. Because somewhere out there the Vandells are watching, waiting for their next victim. Their next Mrs. Vandell. And I'm the only one who knows the truth. Thank you for listening and delving into the dark with me. I would be so grateful if you please click the thumbs up, subscribe, and leave me a comment. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others, and thus our twisted little community will grow. All stories read on this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and many other podcast apps. Links are in the description. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you.